The European Union and the United States have very different regulations on food. I'm also curious your opinion. Is more regulation on food, like the European Union has, better? Or is more loose, like kind of ability to do whatever you want, regulation better, like we have in the US? Obviously, both come with pros and cons. With more regulation, there's more control, and there's, less ability to have freedom to market the food you want to market. But there's also the potential for better control and not having unsafe things go out into the food marketplace. So obviously we can go back and forth on this, but let's take a look at these things. If we look at the EU versus the US, there's some huge differences, and it brings up a great discussion. Again, I want to hear it in the comments, so let me have it. So there's this thing called the Global Food Security Index, and this looks at a few things. It looks at affordability, it looks at accessibility, and it looks at quality. And they ultimately ranked the top 10 countries when it comes down to this. 7 of the 10 countries were in Europe. Okay, now when you look at the US, it was number 9. So it still made the top 10, but the reason that it made the top 10 in this particular rating system is mainly because of the accessibility. Food was much more accessible, not necessarily because of the quality, whereas the EU was doing really well with food quality. So there's no denying that the European Union has better food quality, but let's get an understanding of what the regulatory bodies look like here. So the United States has federal administration that looks over food, right? We have the FDA, we have FSIS, we have the USDA, so looking at food, looking at drugs, looking at agriculture, whatnot, right? Whereas Europe has one non-federal, non-government body that overlooks things. So some would argue that, hey, this is better because it's somewhat independent and it's third party. And yeah, in this case, when you have one body, kind of everything is uniform. There's not this contradiction between different governing bodies. Anyway, let's take a look at how they differ. So if you look at the regulatory differences when it comes down to food, the European Union takes what is called a precautionary approach when it comes down to ingredients and things like that. So anything that is proving to be a little bit wonky in the science or a potential risk, they won't allow. In other words, it's kind of guilty until proven innocent, whereas in the US, it's more of a risk-based system. So things are allowed out into the marketplace if they're generally recognized as safe, and they're out there until they cause a problem. So there's a big kind of toss-up there on which one's better. Like, do you restrict and prevent some of the growth, or do you just let things go and take a little bit of a risk? The other thing that's a little bit different is with nutrition labeling itself. For example, the EU requires more specificity with the labeling, like where ingredients are sourced, the country of origin. This kind of stuff matters, especially in the European Union, where cultural norms are also important. Like if you want good Italian pastries, or like you want to know where it's from. So sometimes the cultural influence comes into play there. With the United States, yes, we have labels, and yes, we have ingredients, and yes, labels are getting a little bit more detailed, but we still don't know where everything is sourced. We don't know if something is natural or not a lot of times, so it can be difficult. Another thing is when it comes down to the regulatory bodies, like the EU has really strict regulations on pesticides and even kind of what happens downstream of that, whereas the US is notoriously a little bit looser with that. And again, that's up for debate. Some of these pesticides, are they safe? Are they not? That's a question for you to kind of answer yourself, because if you look on the internet, it's really hard to get a solid answer. But the bottom line is, even with pesticides, the EU takes a little bit more of a precautionary approach. And finally, in this particular category, the US has what is called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. So if you are bringing a product to market and you have a compound that is known and is already on the generally recognized as safe list, you essentially can bring that product to market. And there may or may not be consequence later on down the line, but if at the time it's generally recognized as safe, it can go out to the market. So you're basically able to put something on the market without pre-approval, and you take the risk that maybe later on down the line, you might have to pull it back. But that's a risk for the business, but it might even be more of a risk for the consumer. The EU doesn't have this. You have to sort of pass quality control, so to speak, before you're on the market. But I want to take a look at what this actually looks like in practice. Like, what does this look like really in daily life, rather than just what the regulation looks like in kind of boring legalese? Let's take GMOs, for example. The EU requires very strict labeling of GMOs. It also requires traceability. So you need to know, like, where this all came from, where the GMOs came from, what they were using. There's complete transparency with the use of GMOs, not to mention significantly less GMOs in the EU. They're still there, just not as much as they are in the US. With the US, it's very loose. Like, you don't have to know where it came from. You don't even have to know if something is GMO or not. So this has been a big topic of conversation. No matter where you stand in terms of GMOs, people feel that they have a right to know if something is genetically modified or not. As a matter of fact, a lot of the genetically modified foods that are in the United States would be considered completely illegal in the EU. So that makes people wonder, well, what is different about the food there, right? It really does pose these questions you have to ask yourself. Then we look at the topic of antibiotics. Antibiotics are heavily restricted in the EU, a little bit looser in the US. However, being realistic, like, a lot of organizations, a lot of food companies are pulling antibiotic meats out. Like, that's just not as much of a big deal anymore. I'm certain it still exists, obviously, but it's becoming less of a prevalent issue. The additives are where things are really, really different. So again, because the EU takes a precautionary approach, there are a lot of additives that are in the US that are simply illegal in the EU. We're talking things like potassium bromate. We're talking things like red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, these food colorings, these different additives. Obviously things like BHA and BHT and all these different potential hormones that are going in milk, right? There's a lot of additives that just simply are not allowed. And this is probably the biggest discrepancy, right? Because when you look on the labels of things in Europe compared to the US, yeah, I mean, no one's denying that the labels are shorter, the ingredient list is shorter. Okay? And if you go and talk about food quality, I mean, things are ultimately going to be fresher because there's less use of preservatives. So you're probably getting fresher, less processed food simply by nature of not having as many preservatives. So the turnover, the shelf life is going to be less. This is, again, major topic of discussion for a lot of people. Like, what is the right way to go? Like, are these things that are not showing major issues in terms of safety, should they be allowed? Or should we be taking a little bit more of this precautionary approach that says, hey, this could be sketchy. Do we even want to put this out to the people? As you know, on this channel, one of the ways this channel stays functioning and alive is through our sponsors. And I want to make a mention that a sponsor that I have talked about for a very long time on my channel, Thrive Market, this is why I like them. Okay, that's a 30% off discount link down below for Thrive Market. But Thrive Market does not have food products that have food coloring added to them, that have preservatives added to them. They're as close to shopping like you're shopping in Europe as you can get. They really do vet every single product that is on their grocery store shelf, even though it's online. Okay, they even make their own products to make sure that the standards are high enough. That's the point. It's not about processed food versus not processed food. It's about how do we up the standard and have a place where people can get good quality food that they can trust, that has good quality ingredients, that's sustainable, that's resourceful, and can also be at a very decent price that's competitive with what they would find in a grocery store. So that link down below is for Thrive Market. Again, that's a 30% off discount link your entire first grocery order. So that whole first grocery order, 30% off, plus a free $60 gift. Not to mention it's easy to shop there because you can search by diet type. Point is that I wish the real grocery stores were like Thrive Market, because Thrive Market has online grocery store like shopping in Europe. Granted, there's still not the same amazing things you can get in Europe, but it's a heck of a lot better. So I highly recommend you check them out. That link is down below, just beneath this video in the top line of the video description. We got to talk about claims and advertising for a second. Okay, the European Union is very strict on the health claims that can be made. So for example, you can, in the United States, you can say something is heart healthy because it has a certain amount of omega-3s in it, even if the rest is a bunch of sugar and saturated fat and even trans fats. Because you have an ingredient that is omega-3s and it's considered heart healthy by some scientific evidence, you have enough literature to support it, you can make a pretty wild claim. So is eating, I don't know, let's say a Twinkie that's fortified with omega-3s, is that really heart healthy? Is it really fair to be able to say that? Whereas in the EU, if you're going to say something is healthy, there has to be legit scientific evidence to back it up, which is why you actually don't see a lot of things just marketed as healthy. It's all just transparency. The EU also heavily regulates the use of the word natural. We can use natural flavoring in the US. We can use natural this. We can call something natural. The EU, if you're going to call it natural, there's strict guidelines. Natural in the EU is closer to what organic is in the US, and even then there's discrepancy. But the point is that there's regulation on what can be said. And in the supplement industry, which this video isn't even about, it's even more intense. In the US, supplements can say whatever they want. Now, this is where I struggle because I'm curious your opinion. Like on one hand, it's like free market capitalism. Like let's like put a product out there and free country and do this. But on the other hand, maybe regulation is a good thing so that people aren't taking advantage of people's actual health. It's like, okay, sure, taking advantage of a situation in business, that's bad. But then when you start going down the other route of taking advantage of health, that could be really bad. So it's like on one hand, yeah, you can bring a product to market and that's great. But on the other hand, are you taking a risk at putting something that maybe isn't that great for people? I don't know. Another thing that's different is the marketing to children. There's very limited programming for food or high sugar products to kids, especially under the ages of 12. So like in the UK, they can't advertise high sugar stuff, things like that after certain hours on TV. There's all kinds of different regulation there. As a matter of fact, Sweden has completely outlawed advertising food to children altogether under 12. And that's interesting because in the US, we do have some regulation on that, and it's getting better, I do have to say. Even though some of the foods for children are wacky and crazy, some of the things that come out, some of the regulation on how it's marketed is getting better. There is a little more control happening there. Now, when it comes down to nutritional labeling, I find this interesting. When I was traveling through Europe, I noticed this thing. It has this thing called a Nutri-Score. To be honest, the Nutri-Score was pretty accurate. It was like a rating of like an A, B, C, D, F type rating system on food where you could see, hey, this thing is actually rated an A. And you know what? Generally it was right. It was like high protein dairy was rated like an A or a B. Like fruit was rated like an A. Veggies were rated like an A. Then you get into some like sweet potato crackers. They might be rated like a C. Then you get into something that's sweet like an animal cracker or animal cookie. It was like rated a D or an F. Honestly, it was pretty accurate. But what's interesting is they have front of package labeling anyway. So you have to see the calories, the saturated fat, the sugar on the front of the package. So if you're in a hurry and you see something, you not only see a Nutri-Score, but you do see at a glance the calories and a couple other things, which I think we could get a lot more success in the US if we did that. People are daunted and they're scared of that crazy label on the back. And we also allow like a 20% delta on calories. Now, I don't know if the EU has this or not, but a 20% delta on the calorie count, which means that we could be over or under 20 calories on whatever it is we're looking at. What I noticed in the EU when I was in Europe last, they have the calories and the kilojoules, and you can see in the calories that it's like 138 calories instead of rounded to 130 or whatever. It gets down to the single digit of what the calories are. I thought that was very unique. It tells me that maybe it's a little bit more specificity, but either way, these things are determined through what's called a bomb calorimeter, which isn't gonna give you a super accurate because that's like a closed thermodynamic system to measure heat. So it doesn't exactly give you the best outline of how much energy is really in these foods. I digress. This is where things get insanely interesting though. The EU gives flexibility to cultural norms. So an example of this is Poland really wants sustainability and shelf life. Okay, as a relatively lower, lower economic country, it made more sense, and also a climate, to have things be preserved better. So like for honey, for them, they want pasteurized honey that can stay on a shelf longer. Just an example. Finland prides themselves on their honey quality. It is literally illegal to pasteurize honey in Finland. So what they'll allow is the honey in Finland to come across EU borders into states or countries like Poland that really require pasteurization. So it's just because something is produced in a certain place doesn't mean that it's going to apply across other borders. Another example is in France with raw dairy. The French love their good quality dairy, and raw dairy is a cultural norm for them. So they are allowed to have raw dairy, although EU standard is to pasteurize it. It's sort of like how it is with certain things in the United States that are illegal federally, but maybe legal at a state level. There's also certain regions in Italy that pride themselves on cheeses like Parmigiano Reggiano. This is a cheese that really needs to be created in a specific region where the EU says, hey, we can sell this, and it can kind of skirt some of the EU guidelines as long as it's made here. Same with like prosciutto di Parma, has to be produced in a certain region of Italy. So these things matter. And then Spain, for instance, Spain is very interesting because they have a big pride on their cured meats, and certain meats that are cured in Spain are cured for years. Okay, the EU wouldn't allow dry curing of meats for years because maybe there's a risk involved with it. Now, in Spain, they allow it, and they'll allow Spanish cured meat to cross EU, other domestic, treated sort of as domestic borders, even though they're going to a different state. And then, for example, Germany. Germany has a very high bread standard, and their bread standard is gonna say, hey, this needs to be like wholesome, real ingredients, like whole grain, the sourdough needs to be real. These things matter. So the cultural norms play a big part, and that influences what the EU does. So because of the culture and the history in the EU, food quality is truly preserved, and we're not getting as much hybridized, hyper-palatable stuff that we might get in the United States. So again, I leave it to you. I'm curious what you think.